many 737 MAX aircraft Southwest Airlines had ordered from Boeing prior to the Lion Air crash?
Congressman, I don't know the exact number, but we can find it for you.
Well, we were told it was 280. And do you contest the fact that Southwest Airlines would have gotten a $1 million rebate per plane had the pilots had to go through simulator or D training?
Chairman, I believe that was part of the contract structure we had with Southwest.
Did you have contracts like that with other customers?
Congressman, I don't know if there are any other customers with that specific clause, but it's not uncommon for us to have incentive clauses in these contracts.
So that would have totaled, obviously, $280 million that would have had to have been paid. Because I think a real key issue is how we got to this point and how MCAS was not in the manual. That's been my question since way back when. Let's move on to undue pressure, key learnings, and next steps. Slide. There it goes. This was a survey which was provided to us by a whistleblower. It was in 2016. If we go to the next slide, I am concerned about consequences if I report potential undue pressure, 29%. Then if we go to the next slide, when these engineers are also ARs, lines are frequently blurred between when the engineer is acting in an applicant's SME role and when they are in an AR role. That was 2016. And I'll give you, in a minute, a chance to respond, but it seems like you didn't pay much attention to the survey and the undue pressure because we then have, and I may have read it improperly before, but he says he was the leader of the 737 program. He was writing to the general manager, talks about workforce exhausted, schedule pressure. I'm sorry to say I'm hesitant about putting my family on a Boeing airplane. That's 2 years later. It doesn't seem like anything was done to relieve the undue pressure and this culture where people were afraid for their jobs, and there was confusion, which also points to why we need to change this process between, CMEs and ARs, and wait a minute, which hat do I have on? And they're switching hats. In 2003, I said, I don't understand how this is going to work. When I voted against this process, I said, so someone works for Boeing, is paid for Boeing, and then someone else works for Boeing and is paid for Boeing, but this person is totally stovepiped over here and firewalled. They're not responsive to Boeing, they're just responsive to the regulator, but that's not true because apparently they go back and forth between being a development engineer or being, the AR. So, what happened between 16 and 18? Apparently not much. Can you point to any significant steps that were taken to change the culture and relieve this undue pressure?
Congressman, I can, and John will feel free to add in as well. First of all, this survey is a survey that we proactively do with our ODA team. The goal here is to identify any sources of undue pressure. So in this case, these are the survey results that we proactively sought. We gathered all of these results. We've shared them with the FAA, and we've taken follow-up actions associated with these inputs.
That's good, but I'm asking for really concrete examples when you have the leader of the 737 team 2 years later, workforce exhausted, schedule pressure. It doesn't sound like those things were effective.
Congressman, if I could, I'm attempting to answer the question.
Go ahead.
It's a very important topic.
Sure.
You'll also see on the survey data here that over 90% of our employees are comfortable raising issues, and I think the number is 97% understand the process for doing so. Those are very high scores. We'd still want them higher, but we try to create a culture where our employees can speak up and raise issues so we can take action in response. So that is the culture we're trying to incentivize. Now, I will say it's true that we have competitive pressures every day. We operate in a tough, globally competitive world. but that never takes priority over safety. And I know we've had this discussion, but I can tell you our culture as a company, the only long-term sustained business model is safety. And that's because our airplanes last for decades. And having a culture where people are willing to speak up, including the people that responded to this survey, is part of creating that culture. John, you might be able to comment on specific actions we've taken.
Yeah, and I think they're actually two separate things. So this was actually looking at the ARs and the undue pressure, and that's a defined area that the FAA has us act on. We do recurrent training with the managers in engineering, manufacturing, and quality about how they deal with ARs and how they need to be treated and what is undue pressure. And we do take follow-up actions. We do audits, and the FAA has come in and actually audited what we did, and they have agreed with what actions were taken. I think, the other pressures that were alluded to later, or 2 years later, it was not an AR, to my understanding. And I think that it talks about more of the pressures that Muhlenberg was referring to.
And again, as I mentioned earlier, I did receive a letter from that individual, and I think he raised some good points, things that we want our people to raise. We, subsequent to that, evaluated those. We talked to our 737 team.
But you didn't reduce the production rate, as you said earlier. You stayed at 52 points. If I could, I don't want to prolong this too much.
Production rate stability, again, sir, is actually better for safety. Consistency in the factory is safer for our workers.
Unless it's moving a little too quick. So just to go back to the issue of how this all happened, and it started with a phone call in 2011. I brought that out at the beginning. You had an exclusive Boeing customer who called and said, can't match Airbus fuel economy and no pilot retraining necessary. We're buying all Airbus. And then you had, and the story is that we didn't rush, except you were looking at, you have a 50-year-old airframe here, some of the reasons, the problems we had, and why you had to develop MCAS as opposed to a more stable platform was because we're dealing with a 50-year-old airframe. You've still got hydraulic controls. You've got you're in the newer planes. My understanding is when you have something serious going on, you actually get prioritization in a more visible way. The disagree light didn't even work. But we're being told that this, safety was always paramount. People didn't feel pressure. Things weren't rushed. But I just don't buy that. And instead of building a clean sheet design, you might have lost market share for a year or two to Airbus. But then you would have come along with a fabulous 21st century airplane that probably would have been better than the Airbus, and you wouldn't be going through what you're going through today. That was a critical mistake that was made back then, and I believe it exerted pressure throughout the organization from the top down, and it's going to be very hard to restore confidence. And again, when you have the guy who was the leader of the 737 program saying, I'm sorry to say I'm hesitant about putting my family on a Boeing airplane. That's very sad comment on what has happened to the culture of the company. With that, Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to ask a question.